"A lie is a lie is a lie," Whoopi Goldberg said. It was May 2nd, and she was on the set of The View, the daytime talk show that she co-hosts. The subject was Attorney General William Barr, who had argued that the special counsel Robert Mueller's report was not as alarming as it seemed, endorsing Donald Trump's claim that there had been no collusion, no obstruction, in the Russia case. Goldberg was incredulous. "Our parents taught us, if you lie, there are consequences," she said. When are consequences coming back? Her guest, the attorney Alan Dershowitz, offered an answer that combined legal analysis and political handicapping. "They come back in November of 2020, when we all go to the polls and we vote against people that we think lied," he said. "But it would be a terrible thing," he held up a finger for emphasis, "to criminalize lies." Dershowitz is a frequent guest on shows like The View. For decades, he has been a frequent guest just about everywhere. If you are a television producer putting together a segment about a celebrated criminal case, Dershowitz is an ideal booking. Intellectually nimble and supremely confident, he is an emeritus professor at Harvard Law School but also an occasional reader and subject at the tabloids. Over the years, he has written thousands of newspaper articles, magazine columns, and web posts. With help from research assistants, he has published 36 books, including The Best Defense, Chutzpah, and Sexual McCarthyism, that recount his cases and advance his opinions. In recent years, as Dershowitz approached the age of 80, his public presence faded a bit. But Trump's presidency has enabled a comeback. Dershowitz, a proponent of civil liberties, has made a specialty of defending people who do outrageous things, and Trump does outrageous things constantly. Media outlets looking for someone to argue Trump's side have been happy to have Dershowitz on the air, explaining why the president's critics are putting politics before the law. In May, an edition of the Mueller report, with an introduction by Dershowitz, made the Times bestseller list. On The View, Goldberg promised the audience that she'd hand out copies of the book after the taping. But she remained skeptical of Dershowitz as defense of Barr. He offered an explanation: lying to Congress or to the FBI was illegal, but misleading the public was not. "The rule of law requires that we distinguish between sins and crimes," he said. "There's no federal crime that says that it's illegal to lie to the media." After a commercial, the next segment began, with images of several controversial Dershowitz clients: Klaus von Bülow, O.J. Simpson, Mike Tyson. The lineup included Jeffrey Epstein, a wealthy money manager who had been accused of sexually abusing underage girls. Starting in 2005, investigators had traced a sex trafficking operation that extended from mansions in New York and Palm Beach to a Caribbean island, Little Street, James, that Epstein owned. As charges became public, press accounts enumerated his famous acquaintances, including Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, and Kevin Spacey, and described trips to the island on his plane, the so-called Lolita Express. Despite sworn accounts from more than a dozen women, Dershowitz and his team secured a deal in which Epstein pleaded guilty to minor charges and served only a brief sentence. On The View, which was hosted by 4 women, Dershowitz described the experience as fraught. "It's a case that was very, very difficult, and very, very painful for me, because I saw real victims out there. I'm a very strong supporter of the Me Too movement, but," he said, "an attorney is obligated to defend the rights of the accused. I think of myself like a doctor or a priest. If they wheel Jeffrey Epstein into the emergency ward, the doctor is going to take care of him." Dershowitz put it differently to me. "In one of a series of conversations this spring and summer, every honest criminal lawyer will tell you that he defends the guilty and the innocent." One of the hosts, Abby Huntsman, pointed out, "It does get more complicated for you in your personal life." In 2014, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, one of Epstein's victims, stated in a court filing that Epstein lent her out for sex to his friends, Dershowitz among them. Dershowitz has strenuously denied the allegations, and maintained that Giuffre is a near-pathological liar engineering an extortion plot. Giuffre's claims about him have never been directly tested in court. Instead, they have featured as side arguments in civil suits brought by others. 2 weeks before the taping, though, Giuffre had sued Dershowitz directly for defamation. On the air, Dershowitz said that he welcomed Giuffre's lawsuit. "I also welcome her coming on this show and accusing me face-to-face," he said. "I have been falsely accused," he went on, more intently. "So I am welcoming this trial." He rubbed his hands together. "This is the first opportunity I have to conclusively prove my innocence." Huntsman read a statement from Giuffre. "My abusers have sought to conceal their guilt behind a curtain of lies. My complaint calls for the accounting to which I, and the other victims, are entitled." "She's right. She's entitled to an accounting," Dershowitz said. "I have," Alan Goldberg said. The segment was running out of time, invited the FBI to the trial. "Alan, you gotta stop." "So that, Alan, you want me to give the book away?" "We've gotta give the book away." Dershowitz recovered his composure and smiled for the camera. Before the show cut to commercial, he got in a last word. "My reputation is more important than my book." For decades, while Dershowitz was teaching at Harvard Law School and practicing as a criminal defense lawyer, he collected notes from his critics and posted the most vitriolic ones on his office door. "You are a demon of evil. You are the best argument for abortion one could present." The notes signaled to students that the law was an arena of principled, if gleeful, combat, a message reinforced by Dershowitz's habitual manner of genial belligerence. When he was attacked, not just by note writers but also by colleagues in the bar and by an occasional judge, it only confirmed the efficacy of what Dershowitz has called his confrontational legal style. He specializes in appellate law, working to overturn convictions on appeal, a branch of law that often requires dismantling the strategy and the arguments of other lawyers. Lawrence Tribe, a constitutional law expert and a longtime associate of Dershowitz's at Harvard, told me, "He revels in taking positions that ultimately are not just controversial but pretty close to indefensible." Dershowitz describes his early life as an ideal preparation for conflict. He grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and has written that he often got into fights with Italian kids in the neighborhood, though I don't recall getting anything worse than a few deep cuts, several broken teeth, and one concussion. His mother, Claire Dershowitz, disputed this account, telling the Washington Post the only time his tooth was knocked out was when he played tennis at yeshiva. He had a reputation as a wise guy, and his principal recommended that he become something where you use your mouth but don't need much brains. His fellow students, drafting the yearbook, wrote that he had a mouth of Webster and a head of clay. At Brooklyn College, he began to apply himself, and he excelled. In 1959, he was admitted to Yale Law School. Before moving to New Haven, he married Sue Barlick, a young woman from Bayonne, New Jersey, whom he had met during high school, at a Jewish summer camp in the Catskills. She was 19 when they arrived in New Haven, and within 2 years they had a son. Sue's younger sister, Marilyn, dated Dershowitz's younger brother, Nathan, and they often came to New Haven to visit. In 1963, Sue and Alan's second son was born. Dershowitz felt like an outsider at law school. He has written that, when he gave his first presentation, his accent was openly laughed at, as was his non-preppy garb, which included Bermuda shorts with a Phi Beta Kappa key ostentatiously dangling from a pocket. He kept kosher, which meant that he couldn't eat in the common dining room, and he didn't drive or work on the Sabbath. When he was being considered for the position of editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, classmates asked if his religious observance would interfere with editorial responsibilities. He got the post anyway. During his second year, he applied to some 30 Wall Street law firms for a summer job and was rejected by all of them, notably by Gravett, Swain. In 1976, he represented an Italian-American lawyer who was suing the firm for religious and ethnic discrimination. Still, he made an impression at Yale. Dershowitz graduated at the top of his class and went on to serve as a clerk for two esteemed liberal judges, David Bazelon, of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and Arthur Goldberg, the Supreme Court Justice. In 1964, Dershowitz was hired as an assistant professor at Harvard Law School, and at 28 became a full professor. Stuart Eisenstadt, a student of his who later became a policy advisor to President Jimmy Carter, told me, "He was the most exciting, most engaging professor I had at Harvard Law School." Dershowitz established himself as a civil libertarian, with a particular interest in the rights of the mentally ill. An impassioned First Amendment advocate, he defended neo-Nazi speech and pornography, starting with I Am Curious, Yellow, an earnestly smutty Swedish film released in 1967. He joined the National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union, and represented many litigants pro bono in cases involving challenges to censorship and to the death penalty. Nancy Gertner, a former federal judge who worked with Dershowitz in the late 70s and now teaches at Harvard Law School, told me, "He's very brilliant, just in the sense of the speed at which his mind works, and how prolific he is in churning out thoughts." From the beginning of his career, Gertner said, he had the imagination to see strategies and arguments other people don't. He also understood, before most of his peers did, the value of deploying the media. As he wrote in his 2013 memoir, Taking the Stand, if you don't have the law or legal facts on your side, argue your case in the court of public opinion. Dershowitz seemed to delight in publicity, even though he told friends that the aggressive and fast-talking know-it-all who appeared on TV wasn't really him. Some members of the law school faculty were nonplussed by his media presence, his self-promotion, and his decision to take on cases while teaching. But Dershowitz heeded advice that he said Judge Bazelon had given him: don't follow in anyone's footsteps. Your feet are too big to fit anyone else's print. Create your own life, Dershowitz once wrote. It was scary, but it fit my personality to a T. In December 1971, while Dershowitz was on sabbatical in Palo Alto, his 10-year-old son, Elon, was diagnosed as having a brain tumor. Dershowitz, distraught, became fixated on finding a cure. I couldn't concentrate on my book, he wrote, in Taking the Stand. My marriage, which had been suffering for several years even before our trip to California, was now in deep trouble. After surgery, Elon eventually recovered, but the marriage did not. When the family returned to Cambridge, Dershowitz immersed himself in a case in New York, in which he successfully defended a member of the militant Jewish Defense League against a murder charge in the bombing of 2 office buildings. Dershowitz's collaborators were Harvey Silverglate, a former student of his, who had a small firm in Boston, and Gene Baker, a law school student who was a research assistant there. Working together with these 2 extraordinary young lawyers, he wrote, made it clear to me how unhappy I was in my marriage. In 1973, he and Sue separated, after 14 years of marriage, and she soon filed for divorce. The case went to court in early 1976, and the proceedings were acrimonious. Judge Haskell Friedman's lengthy findings of fact, he wrote that Dershowitz's behavior toward Sue negatively affected the plaintiff's health to the extent that she required medical treatment and briefly some psychiatric therapy. Dershowitz denies mistreating her, and his son Elon said that he witnessed no improper treatment. Sue had been given provisional custody of the children, but Dershowitz, represented by his friend Silverglate, was seeking sole custody. He brought in a psychiatrist named Pierre Johannet as an expert witness. At first, Johannet recommended joint custody. But in an appearance a month later he testified that he had changed his mind, after listening to tapes of phone conversations between Dershowitz and Sue. Dershowitz has a long habit of recording calls, but says that he has no recollection of taping these. Judge Friedman, too, was influenced by the tapes. In the conversations, Sue addressed Dershowitz in the most disparaging terms, according to the findings. She called him names over the telephone while the children listened. The judge noted that Sue interfered with Dershowitz's visits with the children and harshly insulted Jean Baker, who had become Dershowitz's girlfriend. Friedman relied on testimony from a number of witnesses, including Sue's sister, Marilyn, who by then was married to Dershowitz's brother, that Dershowitz would do more to help the children adjust to the divorce. Friedman acknowledged that Johannet had reversed his position, but that, he wrote, merely proved that he was a truly objective witness. He awarded Dershowitz custody. The couple's dispute over alimony was no less fraught. Sue maintained that Dershowitz had substantially understated his income. In response, Dershowitz submitted 2 doctors' affidavits stating that he had developed hypertension. One recommended that he slow down from his present hectic professional pace. The judge decided that he should pay Sue a modest sum for 5 years and nothing thereafter. The divorce seemed to liberate Dershowitz. He dated widely, becoming a familiar presence at the bar of Harvest Restaurant, in Cambridge. In 1982, Dershowitz was giving a speech in Boston, and a psychologist named Carolyn Cohen came to hear him. He spotted her in the back of the room and was transfixed. They soon began living together, and were married 4 years later. Their daughter was born in 1990. They bought a house in Cambridge and vacationed on Martha's Vineyard. Sue Barlick moved to New York, and for several years worked as a research librarian for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. On New Year's Eve, 1983, she drowned in the East River, in an apparent suicide. One night, in 1980, Dershowitz appeared at Harvard's Quincy House dorm, where the porn film, Deep Throat, was scheduled to be screened. He was prepared for controversy. The movie's female star, Linda Lovelace, had recently published a memoir, Ordeal, in which she said that her husband had forced her at gunpoint to perform in the film, and her case had become a feminist cause célèbre. In the days before the screening, some female residents of Quincy House had objected to being subjected to abuse and degradation right in our own living room. 4 years earlier, Dershowitz had represented Harry Reams, the movie's male star, who had been convicted of conspiring to transport an obscene film across state lines. Dershowitz saw the suppression of Deep Throat as a violation of free speech. He was also not convinced that Lovelace's performance was coerced. In The Best Defense, he recalls asking Reams about her claims. Reams, he wrote, laughed and said, "Are you kidding? She was really into it." After young women at Quincy House asked police to prevent the screening, Dershowitz maintained that a fundamental liberty was at stake. If there is anything more obnoxious to a civil libertarian than the punishment of speech after it has taken place, it is the issuance of a prior injunction to prevent speech in the first place, he wrote. Dershowitz argued in various places, including a monthly column he wrote for Penthouse, that radical feminists were using Lovelace to advance an all-out war against pornography. When a crowd of viewers and protesters gathered in front of Quincy House for the screening, he told them, "Feminist fascists are no better than any other kinds of fascists." During the 80s and 90s, Dershowitz continued to advocate for civil liberties, but his cases increasingly centered on celebrity, wealth, and greed. In his book, Letters to a Young Lawyer, Dershowitz identified some common traits among his most infamous clients. Each of these defendants has virtually unlimited quantities of some things, such as money, power, or access to sex or power. They, like everyone else, also had limited quantities of other things, such as life, health, duration of career, reputation, time with family, etc. They got into trouble by putting at risk what they had limited amounts of in order to increase the quantities of those things they had unlimited amounts of. His first tabloid famous client was Claus von Bülow, a Danish-British aristocrat who had been convicted of trying to kill his wife, the heiress Martha Sonny von Bülow. In 1982, he hired Dershowitz to appeal the conviction. Von Bülow, trained as a lawyer, had polished manners and, as a result of his marriage, a vast fortune. Describing his first visit to von Bülow's residence, Dershowitz wrote, "I had passed by many of the elegant mansions along Fifth Avenue on my way to and from the museums. I had never actually been inside one. There was a wood-paneled elevator, artworks in the hallway, and a sitting room with antique leather-bound books on the shelves. I felt I was in a different world," he wrote. Von Bülow had been convicted of attempting to kill his wife by injecting her with insulin. Afterward, she lapsed into a decades-long coma, from which she never emerged. Dershowitz, leading a team of law students and young associates, devised an appellate argument built around the idea that Sunny might have caused her own coma through a prolonged addiction to pills and alcohol. In 1984, Dershowitz got the conviction reversed, and, in a new trial, von Bulow was acquitted. Dershowitz wrote a book about the case, Reversal of Fortune, which was published in 1986. Nora Ephron, reviewing it for The Times, noted Riley, throughout, in the venerable tradition of defense lawyers who write books about themselves, Mr. Dershowitz made brilliant decisions no one else would ever have been brave or intelligent enough even to consider. Dershowitz wrote a letter to the editor complaining that Ephron was deriding his work in order to help get a friend's book about the same case published. The friend published no such book, and Ephron replied, "I wasn't even a friend." Reversal of Fortune sold poorly, but Elon, who was involved in the film business, thought that it might find a larger audience as a movie. In 1990, it was released as a major Hollywood film, with Elon as a co-producer. Dershowitz, played by Ron Silver, is portrayed on screen as a committed fighter for principle. "I'm not a hired gun," he tells von Bulow, played by Jeremy Irons. "I've got to feel there's some moral or constitutional issue at stake." Several Harvard Law School students who were in Dershowitz's criminal law class the following spring told me that they were excited to be taught by a legal celebrity. But some of the women in the class found his lectures uncomfortable. Dershowitz has written frequently that defending the rights of the accused in rape cases is a crucial application of the presumption of innocence. In Contrary to Popular Opinion, published in 1992, he included a list of cases in which women acknowledged having made false accusations of rape. He argued, it is precisely because rape is so serious a crime that falsely accusing someone of rape should be regarded as an extremely serious crime as well. Imagine yourself or a loved one being falsely accused of raping a woman. Some students thought that he strained logic in order to defend men. In Dershowitz's view, men who are accused of rape, there has got to be a defense, one female student from the 1991 class recalled. He had convoluted ways of thinking about how men could misinterpret lack of consent. And it wasn't relegated to when we were speaking about a rape case. Wherever we were on the syllabus, he would bring it up. William Kennedy Smith, a nephew of John F. Kennedy, had recently been accused of raping a woman on a Kennedy family estate, and Dershowitz frequently spoke to the media about the case. Smith argued that the sex was consensual, and he was later acquitted. In class, according to a second female student, who is now the chief executive of a non-profit, he would talk about Smith and the woman frolicking in the waves, ripping off their clothes. Midway through the semester, a woman raised her hand and said, essentially, "Okay, enough rape examples. There are women in this class who have been raped. Can we move on to something else?" His hair just caught on fire. Murph Wilcott, a male student who was in the class during the confrontation, recalled. He seemed to take that as a challenge to his authority, and he made it clear he was going to teach what he wanted to teach. Dershowitz told The New Yorker, there was a controversy in the class, and a very small number of students objected to the teaching. His intention, he said, was to play devil's advocate in order to challenge students' thinking. Dershowitz has not shied away from provocative ideas about sex and the law. In a 1997 op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, he argued against statutory rape laws, writing, "There must be criminal sanctions against sex with very young children, but it is doubtful whether such sanctions should apply to teenagers above the age of puberty, since voluntary sex is so common in their age group." He suggested that 15 was a reasonable age of consent, no matter how old the partner was. He has also argued against punishing men who hire prostitutes. In a 1985 article, in the Gainesville Sun, Dershowitz proposed that a John, who occasionally seeks to taste the forbidden fruit of sex for hire, should not be arrested. The nonprofit executive recalled his discussing the idea in class. He said, "Prostitutes know what they're doing, they should be prosecuted." But you shouldn't ruin the John's life over that. If I had raised my hand to challenge that, I would have been singling myself out as, God forbid, a feminist. When people at Harvard objected to Dershowitz's views, he insisted that civil liberties were more important than political sensitivities. In April 1991, Mary Jo Frug, a professor at New England Law, was murdered by a knife-wielding assailant near her house, in Cambridge. The following March, the Harvard Law Review published an article that she had been working on when she was killed, a postmodern feminist legal manifesto, which examined how law perpetuated the subjugation of women. On the anniversary of Frug's murder, the Harvard Review, a spoof overseen by editors of the Review, published a parody, the Manifesto of Post-Mortem Legal Feminism. The author, Mary Jo, was described as the rigor mortis professor of law. The commentary, written in the first person, was pieced together from scraps dictated to Eve XX, a telekinetic feminist, from beyond the grave. The Review held its gala banquet that night, and left copies of the Review on guests' plates. Liberal professors at the law school were outraged. Lawrence Tribe likened the students who had written the spoof to Klansmen. He and David Kennedy signed a letter, along with a dozen other professors, decrying the law school's atmosphere of sexism and misogyny. The students apologized, but the furor did not die down. In a column for the Los Angeles Times, titled, "Harvard Witch Hunt Burns the Incorrect at the Stake," Dershowitz acknowledged that the parody was somewhat offensive, but argued that the response indicated a systemic problem. The overreaction to this spoof is a reflection of the power of women and blacks to define the content of what is politically correct and incorrect on college and law school campuses, he wrote. Radical feminists can accuse all men of being rapists, and radical African Americans can accuse all whites of being racists, without fear of discipline or rebuke. Dershowitz often suggested that contention was an inevitable effect of protecting ideals. In Taking the Stand, he quoted a favorite passage from H.L. Mencken: "The trouble about fighting for human freedom is that you have to spend much of your life defending sons of bitches, for oppressive laws are always aimed at them originally." In the early 90s, Dershowitz represented the Reverend Jim Bakker after he was convicted of defrauding parishioners, and the hotel baroness Leona Helmsley after she was convicted of defrauding tax authorities. He represented Michael Milken after he was convicted of financial fraud. In a number of cases, he represented prominent men who had been accused of committing violence against women. He helped get O.J. Simpson acquitted in the killing of his wife. He represented Jeffrey McDonald, a former Green Beret doctor convicted of killing his wife and his 2 daughters, and Mike Tyson, who had been convicted of raping an 18-year-old contestant in the Miss Black America contest. The victim in Tyson's case, Desiree Washington, claimed that he had brought her to a hotel room in Indiana and forced her to have sex. Dershowitz maintained that Washington had consented to a one-night stand, then tried to exploit it for money and publicity. In his appeal, he argued that the prosecution had improperly excluded testimony from witnesses who saw the two necking in Tyson's limousine before they went to his hotel room. Desiree was hardly the naive virgin she pretended to be, he wrote in Taking the Stand. Instead, she was a sexually active young woman who hung out in nightclubs. In an interview with the Toronto Star, he said that after the incident Tyson had asked